And joining us now in studio, Misha Glenny, author of DarkMarket, How the Hackers Became the New Mafia. Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to see you.
Okay, let's start really at the beginning. Explain to me, we're going to be talking about cybercrime. What exactly is that?
Well, it covers a multitude of sins, really. There are all sorts of different ways that you can exploit new technology, new communications for criminal ends or for nefarious ends. So you have very simple crimes like credit card fraud, with which there is a huge amount of people copying innocent people's credit card details and then using them to buy stuff over the internet or to go to ATM machines and taking money out of their accounts and so on and so forth. And that's the sort of bread and butter of cybercrime, is credit card fraud. And I have to say there is a huge amount of it in Canada.
Wow.
Oh yes, Canada is a big target
Wow.
for credit card fraud. So that's the first one, but there are much more sophisticated things you can do. So if you're a really skilled computer hacker, you can break into, well, let me give you an example of one spectacular crime that happened on the West Coast and was perpetrated by a group of Ukrainians living in Kiev and in Western Ukraine. So they didn't have to get up from their desks in Kiev or Western Ukraine. And they broke into a corporation on the West Coast of the United States, big corporation.
Not to be named?
Not to be named, unfortunately, as I was told this in confidence by an investigator. And so in they went into the computer system and they found the payroll and the human resources department. And what they did is they created about 24 phantom employees, right, on the computer. And they gave those employees a social security number, addresses, and blah, 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 all that stuff. And then they also, so they did that in human resources, and then in the payroll department, they ordered the computer to send out checks to these phantom employees every month. And they made altogether over a 2-year period of about sort of $45 million out of this. Of course, they needed people in the United States, so-called mules, to receive the checks, put them through a bank account, and then send the money on to a bank in Latvia, and then from Latvia it was sent on to Ukraine. So it was a slightly complicated thing. But the point is that they were able to steal a huge amount of money without anyone noticing it. So that's a much more sophisticated cybercrime, and it needs all sorts of organizational skills as well as computer skills. And then you go on to even bigger things where, for example, you could attack an electric grid or a water system. This falls into the area that we know as cyber warfare, which is the possibility of attacking a country's infrastructure. But sometimes it's done for criminal purposes. So people can go into, hackers can go into a company's computer system and encrypt the data on it, which means that you can't access your own information on your computer. And then a couple of days later, you get a note through the post saying, give us $50,000 and we'll unencrypt your data. And this is called data kidnapping. This happens quite a lot. So there's all sorts of wonderful things you can do if you're a cybercriminal.
You know, if we were having this conversation not even 10 years ago, we'd be having a conversation about organized crime. And you'd be telling me about all these insidious things that organized criminals do. 10 years forward now, we're talking about cyber criminals. I'm just wondering, how do the two sort of sets of criminals compare, organized criminals to cyber criminals?
This is a very interesting and important question. In the real world, in the traditional world of organized criminal syndicates, which I also wrote about in my last book, Mafia, yes, where I met a lot of these criminal guys, they have one unifying thing about their business activities, if we look at it as a business, and that is they have to be able to deploy or credibly threaten violence, i.e., so, you know, if you don't do what I say I'm going to do, that you're going to do, then I will come and beat you around the head with a baseball bat. Now, in the cyber world, you don't need to do that all of a sudden, because you don't need to enforce your will in cyber. which means you get a very different type of criminal. So you can engage in cybercrime when you're still at a very young age, when you don't have the ability to call on muscle to enforce your criminal activities. And so what we're seeing is a new breed of criminals who are often much smarter than traditional criminals, which is not to say that you don't find a lot of smart traditional criminals, because you do, but with a completely different skill set. Hacking, first of all, is very important, the ability to go into and explore computer systems. But the other really key thing, and really what is behind a lot of cybercrime, is something called social engineering. Now, social engineering means that you persuade a computer user, innocent computer user, to do something which is actually not in their interest. So you
take me through that. I'm the innocent computer user.
You're the innocent computer user, and I send out to you and to millions of others a spam email which says, you know, do you want to find love? Here's a great dating site. You press on the click thinking you're going to find some people who you might want to date. And in fact, what happens is your computer is infected because you've been persuaded to do something which is not in your interests, i.e. to click on that link which will download a virus onto your computer. And once that virus is downloaded onto your computer, whoever put the spam email there can control your computer. You still think that your computer is working normally, but actually it's being controlled from outside, and they can steal money from you, they can steal your identity, they can use the computing power of your machine for a huge attack. You know, anywhere in the world, a so-called denial of service attack, DDoS attack. So you've got, you don't have to have hacking skills to be engaged in computer crime. In fact, I think about 80% of computer crime is a consequence of this phenomenon that we call social engineering, of persuading people to do
80%. This is scary stuff because there's not a lot of transparency. Like in traditional crime, I know if someone's going to come, you know, if someone's inside my house, I might come back and find my stuff gone. But what you're saying is that this is so insidious that I don't even know I'm being a victim of crime.
You don't know you're being a victim. Of course, I like to look at it slightly positively, and that's because cybercrime tends not to involve violence. At least it doesn't involve violence. So nonetheless,
I suppose that's the glass half full way of looking at it. That's the glass half
full way of looking at it. Nonetheless, I mean, one of the things that I found when I was doing DarkMarket is speaking to some of the victims. When they started describing, I said, so what was it like when you discovered that, you know, your computer had been completely invaded and they got hold of your passwords and got hold of your bank accounts? I asked them to describe their feelings, and they said, I felt completely violated. It was like if you came home and you had found that somebody had been in your house and burgled everything. And so psychologically, as far as the victims are concerned, it can be very, very similar and extremely distressing for these people.
Let's get into the heart of your book, which is about carding, credit card fraud, really. Yeah. Tell me, what is a credit card frauder or a carder, and what are the techniques that person uses to extract information? You just described one. Is that the only way they get my information, is through a virus?
No. The two most common ways of getting credit card information is, first of all, you can break into a company which stores a lot of credit card information. So, for example, something like Amazon has huge amounts of. Amazon hasn't been breached.
Sony, which happened, didn't it?
Sony happened, but you know, banks happen a lot. I mean, just recently, Citibank, which was claiming to be the safest bank in the United States, just when was it? In about August of last year, had a breach where it lost 200,000 credit cards all in one go. So that's that. And then those credit card numbers are used very, very quickly before the breach is traced and they've blocked the credit card numbers. So, so you get these credit card numbers as a thief, and then you sell them in packages of, say, 5,000 or 10,000, and you can sell them depending on their ease of use. I mean, for example, the United States has been very, very, very slow at introducing what we call in the UK chip and pin.
We started getting that here, I think, recently. I got a new card.
That's right. Very late, and it meant for a very long time North America, and it still is, North America is the favorite target for credit card fraudsters because the banks couldn't be bothered to invest in chip and pin, because for them the loss is not that great. For the people who have to go through the process of having money lost and then getting it back from the banks and having to reorganize their lives because their credit cards are compromised, of course it's very distressing. So that's one way. You break into somewhere where there's a lot of data with credit cards on it, which you can then clone and put on. You make your own card, put it on the back of a magnetic strip, all the information you need. You go to the ATM and you take it out. The other thing they do is with so-called skimming machines. So skimming machines come in two basic forms. One is a little sort of lip, an attachment that you put on an ATM, right? And then you place a little camera above the ATM. Someone comes along with their card, puts it in. It's read by the ATM machine, the card's data, but it's also read by that little lip, the skimming machine. And while you put your PIN number in, there's a camera which is recording the PIN number and sending it remotely to somebody who's sitting across in a cafe on the other side of the road. So that person then has your data, and that person also has your PIN number because of the camera. And I can use the male gender here. I can say it's a him who's sitting in the cafe because about 95% of hackers and people involved in cybercrime statistically are men. So anyway, and they can get hundreds of card numbers like that from the skimming machines. The other type of skimming machine looks just like the thing that you put your card in a petrol station or in a gas station or a restaurant. They're so-called point-of-sale devices. And so what happens is they take your card away, they put them in the restaurant's or the gas station's real machine, read it and take the money for your meal or your gas or whatever, and then they whip it under the table and put it into a second one and record the data off the card.
But that means someone at that gas station or the restaurant's in cahoots. Someone has to put that
That's right.
machine. So it's an inside job in a sense.
Yes, inside jobs are very important in cybercrime. So if you're a cybercrime criminal and you're looking to crack bank accounts, for example, which was a very popular thing in the first decade of this century, the quickest way you do it is the same way that ordinary criminals do it, is you try and get somebody on the inside who can facilitate and speed up your cracking of accounts, because they'll have data information, they'll have passwords and that sort of thing. So for example, there's one character in my book, and he's absolutely for real, who when he started engaging in cybercrime, he set up a news group on Yahoo called bankfrauds@yahoo.co.uk. And if you joined the news group bankfrauds@yahoo.co.uk, he used to advertise it in magazines all over the place saying, want to earn easy money cracking bank accounts? Join bankfrauds@yahoo.co.uk. And he would use this as a sort of tutorial base. He'd charge money for tutorials about how you do it. And of course, if you're a skilled enough computer user, then it's very difficult for police or banks or whoever is involved in law enforcement to track you down. That was certainly the case earlier. I mean, these techniques are improving, it has to be said, but it's still pretty easy to do.
Seems simple in some ways.
Yes, it is.
You profile in your book, the heart of your book is really about a website called Carter Planet. And I just want to show a little bit of an advertisement that Carter Planet put out about 10 years ago. Let's take a look. So this was something that was on the internet. It looks pretty, again, innocuous. If I clicked on that.
These guys were very, very smart. This was they were advertisers. This was a group of people in Ukraine, largely around the Black Sea port of Odessa, and they were trying to think of a way of how do you maximize the money you can make out of cyber. Remember, this is taking place in the former Soviet Union, which has just gone through 10 years of what we know as gangster capitalism. And it's basically the law of the jungle. You've got to survive somehow. And the sort of younger, somewhat corrupted, criminalized class hit upon the fact that they're from the former Soviet Union. They're well educated. They have a strong tradition in math and science and that sort of thing. And they say, well, let's have a look and see what we can do with computers. And so they would start exploring West European, Canadian, and American computers, and they found that they're wide open. So they said, well, how can we make huge sums of money about this by selling all this data? And then they came across the problem that all cyber criminals have to overcome. And that problem is, if I'm doing business with this other cyber criminal, how can I trust him? Because it's axiomatic that as a criminal, he's untrustworthy. So how do I know that he's going to stick by the terms of the deal? Now, in the real world, in the Mafia world, this is where the violence aspect comes in. If he doesn't stick by the deal, then I'll send the boys around to deal with him.
Yeah.
Right. So you can't do that in the cyber world. So
because we don't know who each other is.
Because we don't know who we're dealing with. Right. Exactly. And so Carter Planet came up with this idea of saying, okay, we'll set up this website where people can sell their credit card data freely, but in order to establish trust between the two people doing business, we will set up what we call an escrow office. So it went like this. I have 5,000 credit card data, dumps as they're called. I have 5,000 dumps to sell, and there's a guy who wants to buy them. So I send all that data electronically to the escrow officer at Carter Planet. The guy who wants to buy them sends them the money. The escrow officer then, again, he does this, he doesn't have to get up from his desk, sends some data from the credit cards randomly to his friends around the world, in Toronto, in Wellington, in Rio de Janeiro. They all test and see if it works in ATMs around the world. And if it works, the escrow officer then releases the money to the vendor and the credit cards to the purchaser. And this trick, as it were, this technique devised by the people who ran Carter Planet, there were 5 of them, basically revolutionized credit card fraud around the world.
What's in it for the escrow officer? A little skim off the top, a little money in his pocket?
They take the money from the, when they do the tests around the world, they take that as a fee, and there would be a sort of, there was a variegated fee scale for people on it.
It's interesting. It almost works like a money transfer site that we legitimately use to transfer money across the world, isn't it?
That's right. Well, in fact, this is one of the problems that law enforcement has had since credit card and cybercrime became popular, is the fact that you have all these new money systems, electronic digital money sites, which it's very difficult to track, where you never actually have any cash at all. And this money is shifting around the world electronically, and it's really difficult to track it.
You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that we Canadians are the victims of a lot of credit card crime, but I actually want to talk about the criminal side in Canada. Is there one, and if so, how big is it?
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, it's partly because detection rates in Canada are really pretty low, and wherever you get detection rates being low, then that's seen as an opportunity for people who want to engage in criminal activity. And so Canada, from east to west, has got a lot of people operating. They're sometimes picked up by the FBI and the Secret Service. The FBI and the Secret Service in the United States are the sort of 2 most tenacious law enforcement agencies looking for cyber fraud. And frequently, as was the case actually in DarkMarket, in the case that I detailed, this guy in Calgary who was involved in, he was actually making skimming machines and selling them around the world, and he was a very, very skilled maker of skimming machines, I have to say. Calgary police were alerted by the Secret Service about this guy. The Calgary police wouldn't have picked him up on his own at all. And so frequently Canadian law enforcement is dependent on learning on it from the outside. But even then, it doesn't always work. So there's a huge amount that goes on here in Canada.
I suppose the difficulty also is that this is cross-jurisdictional. So you have different police forces, different countries. I'm guessing that complicates matter in trying to crack down on cybercrime.
Hugely, hugely. So, you know, a cybercrime can be commissioned in Kazakhstan, it can be perpetrated in California, and the money can actually be cashed out in Dubai. And if you've got skilled computer users, they are able to disguise to a great extent where they actually are and what the connection between Kazakhstan, California, and Dubai is. So then the police are faced with this problem that they have in conventional crime as well, is that who do they trust when they're dealing with a cross-border crime? And there are some police forces, for example, the police forces in Kazakhstan, who have very weak relationships with, say, the RCMP or with the FBI. If we look at Russia, where a lot of cybercrime emanates from Russia, and there is strong evidence, which I think I uncovered for DarkMarket, that there is collusion between cyber criminals and the FSB, which is the successor of the KGB. There you have politics in play as well. So the FBI goes to the Russian Interior Ministry and says, we know there's this guy in St. Petersburg who's doing a huge amount of scamming. And because relations between Russia and the United States are poor at that particular moment, the Russians say, we do not know what you're talking about, you know. And so there's a lot of geopolitics involved in cybercrime as well. Why is that the case? Well, one of the reasons is that for the KGB, cybercriminals and their hacking ability is a valuable resource. And this is where we get to this weird synthesis of cyber criminal activity and cyber warfare and cyber security issues. That, you know, with these young kids, and they're often very, very young, you have a tremendous resource to call on if you're a state.
I want to ask you about, we just have a few minutes left, but I do want to ask you about the role of banks in all of this, because at the end of the day, if my credit card gets hacked and my money is spent on my credit card, I phone the bank and I have to answer a few security questions, and all of a sudden they say, oh, don't worry about it, we'll erase those charges. So what's the bank's role in all of this, and who's actually paying for this?
Well, to answer the question, first of all, who is paying for it? The customers are paying for it. How are the customers paying for it? What happens with the banks? This is a very interesting issue. In any other sector of business, nobody has any idea how much they are losing to cyber criminal activity. But banks monitor much more closely how much they're losing to cyber criminal activity. So in contrast to businesses which can't insure themselves against cyber attacks, because the banks gather the data properly, they can insure themselves. So when your money is stolen, $500 or whatever, and the bank sort of says, oh, don't worry, it wasn't you, here's $500 back, you're not liable. They then claim that from the insurance companies who they've paid a premium to insure themselves against credit card fraud. As the amount of credit card fraud rises, the insurance companies raise their premiums that the banks have to pay, and in order to cover for that, the banks raise their charges on all their customers. So
my banking fees.
We're basically all paying for it through the bank charges, through the bank fees. So that we pay for it. Now, for banks, whilst credit card fraud is a pain, it's not a deal breaker. You know, I mean, JP Morgan can lose $2 billion, and you know, it's not going down. Perhaps it should go down, but it's not. So banks were involved in this huge speculative activity in the first decade of this century, while cybercrime was going mad. And you know, there are some cyber criminals, active cyber criminals, who I talk to, and one of them is in this book, and he was saying to us, he said, don't look at us as immoral when it comes to banks, because what banks were doing with all of our money at the time was so immoral that, as far as I'm concerned, we had a right to do what we were doing. Now, there may be some moral difficulties with that argument, but unfortunately, trying to suggest that banks are, you know, occupy the high ground of morality in the past 20 years, no one can do that. You know, so one's sympathy for the banks, I have to say, is very restricted. And also, they see they see credit card fraud as a manageable problem. You know, they really do. They think that level of losses, huge as far as we're concerned, individuals are concerned around the world, but for banks, those levels of losses are acceptable, which is why Canada and the United States have taken so long to introduce chip and PIN, because they think that the expense of creating chip and PIN, which is more expensive technology than the, you know, I mean, I just have to, just for 2 minutes, I cannot believe when I go to New York, for example, and I swipe my credit card and I just sign for it. I mean, that's, you know, that's a charter for fraud. It's just that, because they never check the signature. There's no ID that they're checking against. You can just nick credit cards by the thousands and do that sort of thing. So they decided, American and Canadian banks decided, American banks in particular, decided not to invest in chip and PIN because they felt they could take the losses. So, you know.
This is a fascinating discussion. We're going to continue it tomorrow, where we're going to talk about the people who perpetrate these kinds of crimes. Thank you very much for coming in.
You're welcome.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.